first told you about Taya Ashton back in 2021 when this all happened?
We took into consideration the fact that Taya had rights to be here.
Was when he first learned that Taya was not born a female.
Suitland, Maryland, a small town just outside Washington, D.C., where high-rise apartment buildings line the streets. Life seems as peaceful as any other American suburb. During the day, young families stroll along the lawns, old people sit on their porches, and young people gather in cafes near the subway station. But when night falls, the atmosphere is different, quiet, sometimes cold, as if hiding something untold. In the middle of the town is a multi-story apartment building where a young woman is starting her own life. Taya Ashton, just 20 years old, is beautiful, ambitious, and always smiling at those around her. To her friends, she radiates positive energy. To her family, she is the pride. But behind it all, Taya is still walking on a challenging path, a journey to find acceptance and to be true to herself. Not far away, a 27-year-old man named Alan Price also appeared in the picture. He was not prominent, not attracting attention, but he was attached to Taya in a way that few people knew. There was a connection between them that was hard to name, both close and distant, as if there was something that did not want to be revealed. And it was this ambiguity that created a thick layer of fog, obscuring the truth that no one expected. On the night of July 17, 2021, Suitland was as quiet as ever. But in one apartment in the complex, neighbors suddenly noticed some unusual sounds, tense conversations, hurried footsteps. Then, the space fell silent. No one in the building could have predicted that, just a few hours later, the entire community would be shocked by a heartbreaking truth. What happened behind the door of that apartment? How did a place that was supposed to be safe become the scene of a tragedy? And what is the relationship between Taya Ashton and Alan Price really hiding? These questions still hang in the air, leading us into a story that is both tragic and haunting. The morning of July 17, 2021, passed by normally for most people in the apartment complex in the town of Suitland. But for Taya Ashton, it was a special day. She chatted with friends via text, shared new photos, and talked about unfinished plans. No one would have guessed that those cheerful messages were the last remaining traces of a young girl gradually entering adulthood. In the afternoon, Taya returned to her apartment. Neighbors saw her in the hallway, looking hurried but still having time to smile and greet acquaintances. In the small apartment, the light from the window showed that she was still busy with her own work. The air of a hot summer day made many people in the building just want to close the doors and find some peace for themselves. However, that peace was quickly disturbed by unexpected events. Early in the evening, a visitor appeared at the apartment complex. He was no stranger to Taya. It was Alan Price, a 27-year-old man with whom she had a romantic relationship. The relationship was not widely known, partly because they kept it a secret, and partly because there were many complexities that were difficult to explain. For Taya, it could have been a mixture of trust and fragility. For Price, it was a conflicted struggle. They met in Taya's apartment. No one was sure what was said in that room, but neighbors reported hearing low, sometimes tense conversations through the thin walls. It wasn't the first time such sounds had occurred, but that night seemed longer and heavier than usual. A few minutes later, the noises stopped, leaving an unnatural silence. People upstairs said they heard quick footsteps in the hallway, as if someone was leaving in a hurry. Then everything fell silent. To the neighbors, it was just a passing detail in everyday life. They had no idea that the silence hid a serious truth. Looking back, there were probably warning signs. Taya had told a few friends that she was feeling uneasy about the tension in her relationship. However, she tried to keep it to herself, hoping that things would work out soon. Her friends thought it was just a normal teenage romance, but no one expected that her insecurity would become part of a tragic story later on. As for Allen Price, those who knew him described him as a rather reserved person. In their eyes, Price was not someone who easily expressed his emotions, but sometimes behaved erratically and unpredictably. It was this inner conflict that made anyone who had been in contact with him for a long time feel that something was wrong, even if they could not name it. That night in Taya Ashton's small apartment, the two young people faced each other, with mixed emotions, things that had never been said clearly and hidden secrets. No one directly witnessed everything that happened behind that door, but the scattered sounds, hurried footsteps, and heavy silence left a big question mark for all those who later learned about the incident. And then, when the night passed, the story seemed to end in silence, but that was only the beginning of a series of events that shocked the whole community. In an apartment complex accustomed to quiet nights, sometimes the slightest sound was enough to draw the neighbors' attention. That evening, the person living next door noticed that the light in Taya's room was on for an unusually long time. By midnight, the light was still on, causing anxiety. The first person to sense that something was wrong was a neighbor who lived right next door. He noticed that the light in Taya's room was left on for an unusually long time. Around midnight, when the light still remained on and no further activity was heard, his concern became evident. The neighbor initially intended to knock on the door to ask, but hesitated, not wanting to intrude on the privacy of the apartment. Instead, he decided to call the building manager to check. When the manager arrived, they tried to reach out but got no response. The unease quickly turned into a decision. They would call emergency services. Minutes later, a 911 call came in reporting an emergency at Taya Ashton's apartment. The caller's voice was anxious, her words incomplete, but it was enough for the dispatchers to understand that police and paramedics needed to be dispatched immediately. At the dispatch center, the call was immediately logged and routed to the nearest units. Within minutes, the red and blue lights of patrol cars lit up the small streets of Suitland. Sirens echoed through the night, waking up residents who had been sleeping. Some peeked out their windows, wondering what was happening in their normally quiet neighborhood. As the officers entered the hallway, the atmosphere was tense. Every footstep seemed to echo louder than usual. The police quickly approached Taya's apartment, working with paramedics to check on the situation. The usual procedure was followed, calling loudly at the door, trying one last time to contact them, then using a spare key from the manager to get inside. As soon as they entered, the medical staff understood at a glance that the situation was beyond saving. A brief confirmation rang out, causing a heavy atmosphere to fill the hallway. The news quickly spread through the hallway. Curious residents glanced over, some covering their mouths, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. They were not allowed to get close, but the eyes of the police officers and medical staff said it all. A heartbreaking truth had appeared right in that small apartment. That night, the scene was immediately cordoned off. Yellow tape stretched from the hallway to the entrance, separating the familiar living area of the residents from the space that had now become the focus of a major investigation. Police began taking statements from those living nearby, paying attention to every little detail. Unusual noises, when lights were turned on, or hurried footsteps in the hallway. The first clues were slowly being pieced together, but for the community, all was wrapped up in a single shock. The young girl they used to greet every day now left them in a situation no one could have imagined. And that was just the beginning of a series of big questions waiting to be answered. When Taya Ashton's apartment was sealed off, the entire complex was strangely silent. Yellow tape ran across the hallways, making it seem like a separate world, where all eyes were on it but no one was allowed to enter. Inside, every detail was noted because, for investigators, each item could be an important piece in reconstructing what happened. The living room lights were still on. The small chair was placed a little out of place. A few personal items were lying untouched on the table, as if Taya had not long ago let them go. On the shelf, the pictures of her and her friends were still neatly arranged, suggesting a youthful, hopeful life. But in contrast to that scene, the air was thick with silence, a silence that did not belong in a place that was once filled with laughter. Forensic workers begin their work with meticulous care. They note every detail, the lighting in the room, the air temperature, even the placement of small objects. Every element can help determine the time frame in which the incident occurred. A clock in the bedroom stopped at a specific time, providing a crucial time frame to compare with neighbors' accounts and security camera footage. After completing the scene recording, a medical examination was conducted. The official conclusion was that Taya had died in her apartment on the evening of July 17. The estimated time of death coincided with the time when neighbors heard strange noises in the hallway. The cause of death was clearly established, reinforcing the hypothesis that this was not a natural death, but the result of a deliberate act. In addition, the experts also noted a few unusual details. The door showed no signs of being broken into, indicating that the person who entered was not a stranger. Some small traces in the room revealed that Taya had been staying with an acquaintance, and this quickly directed the next step of the investigation. When the investigation was finished, the apartment was no longer simply the residence of a young girl, but the center of a big question. Who was the last person to be there, and what really happened that fateful summer night? The night of July 17 ended in shock, but that was only the beginning of a complex investigation. With the scene sealed off and the preliminary report completed, the criminal police team entered the crucial phase, searching for the truth behind Taya Ashton's death. Based on forensic details showing that the door had not been forced open, the police believed that the last person inside the apartment must have been a familiar face. Thanks to that, they quickly narrowed down the list of individuals close to Taya: friends, colleagues, relatives, and especially those who had had a romantic relationship with her. As the neighbors' accounts were compiled, a clearer picture emerged. Several confirmed hearing a strange male voice coming from the apartment that evening. One recalled seeing a man hurrying down the hallway. Security camera footage was also pulled up. The images were blurry, but enough to confirm that Taya was not alone in her final hours. Alan Price stood out on the list of people to approach. He was Taya's on and off boyfriend, a relationship that was kept private but not entirely secret. Some of Taya's friends had heard her talk about how the relationship had been strained at times. As a result, Price quickly became the center of attention. When contacted by the police, Price was cooperative, but there were some strange points. Initially, he claimed that he had not seen Taya that day. However, the apartment building's camera data recorded an image of a person with the same build and clothing as him, appearing right around the time that neighbors heard the unusual noise. This inconsistency immediately called Price's testimony into question. The initial interrogation was tense. The investigators peppered him with questions. Where were you on the evening of July 17? Can anyone confirm? What is your relationship with Taya now? Price initially tried to appear calm, but the fragments of his testimony kept contradicting each other. One moment he said he was at home, another he mentioned meeting friends. When the police asked for corroborating evidence, Price fumbled and could not give a convincing answer. Meanwhile, the investigation team continued to expand the collection of evidence. Taya's phone was analyzed, revealing many text messages exchanged with Price in the previous days. The content showed that the two had tense conversations, sometimes ending in long silences. In particular, on July 17, there was a series of text messages between the two recorded, but Price did not mention this detail in his testimony. This was the crucial turning point. The words and the technical data did not match. Investigators began to build the theory that Price was present at the scene, and that a conflicted romantic relationship was the key to understanding the motive. During subsequent questioning, Price appeared to waver. When asked why neighbors had heard him in Taya's apartment, Price responded with evasiveness. At times, he denied it outright. At other times, he admitted to stopping by, but only chatted a little. Each change in his story only strengthened the police's belief that they were on the right track. To build their case, investigators sought out people who knew Price. Many witnesses said he had exhibited a troubled mental state, often worried about being judged by others. Some recalled him mentioning Taya in private conversations as a complex, attached yet conflicted person. These accounts painted a portrait that was far from the calm exterior Price tried to project. The key piece of evidence came when Price's phone's location data was examined. The signal showed that his device had traveled to the exact area of Taya's apartment during the time frame of the incident. This was an undeniable detail because it completely contradicted his previous assertion that he did not see Taya that day. When all the pieces of the puzzle were put together, the police decided to make an arrest. At that point, Price could no longer keep his composure as before. Being confronted with a series of clear evidence forced him to keep quiet, no longer resisting. The investigation then moved into the stage of consolidating the case file, preparing for the prosecution process. The case file was filled with all the elements: inconsistent testimony, technical data, neighbor testimony, and especially phone location evidence. All of them reconstructed a logical scenario, showing that Price was the last person inside the apartment with Taya Ashton. But perhaps what bothered many people the most was the motive behind it. Throughout the investigation, the image of a man struggling with internal conflicts gradually emerged. It was not just an ordinary case, but also a testament to how social prejudices and never-confessed personal secrets can push a person into tragedy. When the case was filed in court, the police and prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to charge him. But for the community, the big question still echoed. How could a relationship that once stemmed from attachment lead to such a cruel ending? After months of preparation, Taya Ashton's case was brought before the Prince George's County Courthouse. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed with people: Taya's family and friends, community representatives, and reporters. Everyone was weighed down because this was not just a typical criminal case, but also a reminder of the fragility of lives seeking the right to be true to themselves. As the trial opened, prosecutors systematically laid out their evidence. They described key timelines, text messages between Taya and Alan Price, cell phone location data, neighbors' accounts, and details from the crime scene. They said that when all of these elements were put together, they painted a clear picture. Price was the last person seen with Taya. The defense sought to minimize his client's responsibility, emphasizing Price's mental state, the pressures he faced, and his immaturity in handling the situation. They sought to portray him as someone caught up in a whirlwind of emotions, rather than someone who intentionally caused the tragedy. On the stand, Price finally admitted his presence in the apartment. However, when questioned further about the reasons and specific events, his answers were repeatedly off-topic and inconsistent. That made the jury pay even more attention to the objective evidence presented by the prosecution. Throughout the proceedings, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense but solemn. Taya's family sat silently, their eyes following every word, every piece of evidence presented. For them, this was a moment of direct confrontation with the man who had changed their daughter's life forever. Some of Taya's friends wept as they heard the final details about her, while community activists clasped hands, calling this a test of justice and fairness. After days of debate, the jury reached its final decision. Price was sentenced to 60 years in prison, 48 of which must be served immediately, with the remainder suspended and subject to reduction if strict conditions are met. The sentence was considered severe, reflecting the court's commitment to handling cases involving prejudice and disrespect for human dignity. As the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent for a few seconds. Then sobs erupted from the victims' families. For them, it was not reparation for their loss, but at least a recognition that justice had been served. Taya's friends said they hoped the verdict would serve as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to let prejudice and bias rule their actions. Outside the court, the media quickly reported the news. Many human rights organizations hailed it as a step forward, demonstrating the seriousness of the legal system in handling cases involving transgender people. Editorials stressed that the sentence was not only for the perpetrator, but also symbolic, sending the message that every individual's life is equally valuable. In the community, the reaction was both sad and hopeful. Sad because of the great loss of a young girl, but also hopeful because finally, justice had spoken. As the courtroom doors closed, the verdict could not ease the void that Taya Ashton's family and friends will carry with them for the rest of their lives. An ambitious young woman has passed away, leaving a void in the hearts of her loved ones and in the memories of the community. This tragedy reminds us that understanding and humanity must come before prejudice, because only when each individual lives safely and with respect can society truly be just. At the same time, this story also reminds us to be vigilant. Silent conflicts, without dialogue and respect, can explode into unpredictable consequences. Justice lies not only in court decisions, but also in the community's responsibility to create a safe and humane environment for all. Taya Ashton has become a symbol of a warning that silence in the face of prejudice can be too costly. But at the same time, her death has left a legacy urging society to move closer to equality. And the question that lingers is, are we really doing enough to protect those around us from similar tragedies?